So the story I want to tell you today is about ketones and brain development. And I want to tell you why I think that's relevant to their application for health reasons, for treating diseases and medical conditions in life. A lot of the work that we've done has been done in partnership with Nestle Health Science in Lausanne, Switzerland. The Keto Chair is primarily funded by a donation that they made, an unrestricted donation that they made to the university a few years ago. And we've gotten funding for projects and research materials from them. So they've been an extremely prolific partner of ours. And most of what I would be telling you, what you're going to hear about today, wouldn't actually have been possible without their very close collaboration with us. So since I'm the first speaker, I just want to remind you of some of the terminology, some of the basic terminology that we're going to be using today. I prefer the short form of the word ketone bodies, but classically the name is ketone bodies, and they're used interchangeably. We'll be referring primarily to acetoacetate and beta hydroxybutyrate, but acetone is produced during ketosis. Its concentrations in the blood are often as high as they are for acetoacetate, and it could be a marker of ketosis as well, but I won't be referring to acetone. Ketotherapeutics, in my mind, is the use of ketones to treat a disease or a medical condition. So that's the context of therapeutics, trying to correct a problem. There are two ways we can be in ketosis. We can generate ketones endogenously when carbohydrates are reduced in our diets, or when total food intake is reduced. That keeps insulin low, and that's endogenous ketosis. There's no external source of ketones that's being supplied, which is the opposite. And it can be combined with exogenous ketosis, but exogenous ketosis is specifically referring to an agent, a product, a ketone ester, a ketone salt, a medium chain triglyceride that will produce ketones when it's administered. There are also ketogenic amino acids. So there's a variety of compounds that could induce exogenous ketosis and be combined potentially with endogenous ketosis. The history of this field goes back 100 years with the treatment of intractable childhood epilepsy. One of the most important developments after treating intractable childhood epilepsy is this GLUT deficiency, an inherited disorder of glucose transport that causes major problems for neurodevelopment in children. Both of those approaches have used the ketogenic diet, so endogenous ketosis. A little further down, I'm mentioning some of the emerging results. These are projects that are showing some promise, but they don't have definitive results in neurodegenerative disorders like Alzheimer's disease, potentially Parkinson's disease. Severe mental illness is coming on radar as a potential therapeutic target for ketosis, autism spectrum disorder, cardiac insufficiency. I put obesity and type 2 diabetes in brackets because yes, ketosis is part of the treatment of these disorders, but the objective is not to induce the ketosis. The objective is to reduce the carbohydrates and make insulin more effective. So it's an indirect, and that's why it's in parentheses, but it's no less important for that. So the question is, why would ketones be therapeutically beneficial for the brain? But why does that happen? And most people fall back to the familiar pioneering study by Owen et al. From 1967 to say ketones were determined in that study to be the main alternative fuel to glucose for the brain during starvation. So of course they're beneficial for the brain. Well, if you're undergoing starvation, yes, that's the case. But is that really why they're therapeutically beneficial, especially in children, which is my second point. And to come a little closer, to make that a little more coherent as an explanation, I think it's important to turn back to the studies that I learned about when I went into the archives of the medical libraries at McGill in Toronto, and perhaps here in Sherbrooke as well, and looked at some of the old stacks of journals from the 1970s with what I would call the data on the golden age of ketone physiology. And I hope we're entering the second golden age, or the platinum age of ketones, who knows. But the first golden age to me was in that period. I want to tell you a little bit about that work, because it focused on brain energetics. And I'm going to start with what was done in the adult, but my objective is to tell you about how that's relevant to the infant. And the technique that was used, because the PET scans weren't available at the time, and so the technique that was used was called arteriovenous difference. And this schematic shows you the square rectangle. The rectangle is the brain. And what we're saying is that you can measure metabolites that are coming into the brain in the arterial blood supply to the brain. And the delta symbol here, you can measure the difference by what is coming out of the brain in the venous supply. So if you have a profile of metabolites that you can measure in both of those blood samples, you can see the difference, and the difference must be due to something that's going on within the brain. Either it's being taken up by the brain, or if the venous outflow contains more of that substance than the arterial supply, then it's being produced by the brain. And that's called arteriovenous difference. I'll give you one example that's directly taken from some of Cahill's work. It was done in the starvation study, actually. So there's two columns in that table. The left-hand column is for the arterial concentration in millimolar, and the right-hand column is for the arteriovenous difference. So if it's positive, that means there's more going into the brain than is coming out. Makes sense for oxygen. The brain's using oxygen, right? The brain is using glucose. The brain is using ketones. The brain is using a very small amount of free fatty acids. And this negative symbol here next to the 0.20 for lactate means that the brain is actually exporting more lactate than it's using under those conditions. So you can see what the whole brain's using. It's relatively simple analysis. It's sometimes ethically challenging to acquire these blood samples, but the data are in the literature. So I'm not going to judge the ethics review that would have been applied at the time. This tells us a fair amount about brain and energetics in adults. So the first example is Owen, 67, and followed up by Drenick in 72, showing that ketones replace a very limited supply of glucose during periods of lengthy starvation. Medically supervised voluntary starvation. The second example is that to refine this point a little bit, Hasselbalch, it's 20 years later, 25 years later, but in fact, they showed that the availability of ketones during a very short period of starvation, 3 or 4 days, spares glucose. And sparing glucose is a good thing to achieve because glucose is used everywhere. So if you can spare its availability under conditions of energy restriction, then you've accomplished something, which is more than just replacing. It's actually providing, making glucose available for other purposes. And Gottstein showed in 1971 that uptake by the brain was directly related to plasma concentrations. So let's look at that point. So these are plotted from those studies. So I compiled these results 10 years ago. And what they're showing is brain utilization of ketones versus the plasma concentration. And note that both axes are on a log scale. Blomkist's work showed that after a very short period of time, this is an error, it should be 2 hours of fasting here. So basically postprandial state, your ketones are very low. After 2 days of fasting, your ketones are up at 1 millimolar. After 40 days, you're up at 6, 7, 8. And after 60 days, you're up over 10 millimolar. These are extreme experiments, but they were voluntary, and they were people who were obese and voluntarily undergoing starvation to lose weight. I'm not sure that's a long-term strategy for their health, but it was It was the way it was done at the time. It was published in JCI, by the way, so it's quite a reputable journal. So what we're showing here is that there's a linear relationship over something like a 600-fold range. I'm not going to go into the details of what that means about ketone transport, but that relationship has been shown in those 4 studies and in many others since then, which is shown here on the second slide or second panel. So those data are all shown here as well, added to which are data, and they're all for beta hydroxybutyrate for total ketones. For acetoacetate, the shape the slope of the line is exactly parallel, but it's a little higher because, as I'll show you, brain uptake of acetoacetate is slightly more efficient than beta hydroxybutyrate. So we got both of them ketones. We're seeing some of these data are for older people, some of them are for Alzheimer patients, some of them are before they go on a medium chain triglyceride supplement, some are after. And most importantly for me, some of these results are with arterial venous difference, some of them are with PET scans, and they've been confirmed by methods that don't involve either of those approaches. So what I'm showing you is a relatively strong data set combined from various sources showing this linear relationship over a large range. For a backup fuel, trying to solve problems for the brain in the adult under various conditions, that's exactly what you want, because it's there to save your life, basically. So that's very reassuring in terms of even if you've got Alzheimer's disease, the brain will still use those ketones, which is why it led to our approaches with interventions in Alzheimer's disease. Added to this, the data I just showed you is the fact that, okay, the brain can use ketones, and Garber showed also with arterial venous difference, but across the liver, that the production of ketones is substantial under those conditions of early fasting or early starvation, 3 or 4 days fasting. The capacity to produce the amount of ketones that would be needed by other organs, especially the brain, it can be met by the supply that can be produced. So that's reassuring as well. But this is an enzyme-dependent system. And what I'm going to show you is that the enzymes that you need to metabolize ketones were also shown in that golden age of the 70s to be present in the fetus at 15 weeks, in the newborn, in the child that's 3 to 9 years old, and in the adult up to 80 years old. Whether it's the first stage to convert beta hydroxybutyrate to acetoacetate, which is essential in order to actually metabolize it and make energy from it, ATP from it, you need to activate it to CoA form with a CoA transferase, and then you need to split the acetoacetate into acetyl-CoA. The red arrows show the process that you need if you want to generate ATP with it. And in each of these cases, those enzymes are present throughout the lifespan. I think we've got the essential elements that suggest that ketones are not just there willy-nilly. They're there because they're solving a problem in the brain. They can be produced in adequate amounts, and they can be metabolized at all stages of the life cycle. But what does this have to do with fasting and preventing brain collapse, energetic collapse during starvation? What does this teach us about that question? I'll leave that with you and turn to earlier stage in life, which is the fetus, infant, in human studies. It's exactly the same image that I showed you for the arterial to venous difference across the brain. And these 4 lines summarize a block of work that was done both with arterial venous difference and with isotope tracer studies at the same period of time. Pearson and Krauss both showed that the neonates have a more active uptake by the brain, so a higher arterial venous difference if they're newborns than if they're infants or children. And that number is 4 to 5-fold higher than it is in the adult. They also show the correlation between the brain uptake and the arterial concentration. Peter Adams showed that in a midterm fetal brain, so after abortion, you could actually measure arterial venous difference across the brain, and he was the first to demonstrate that a large proportion of the glucose that's going into the brain is actually being exported as lactate, at least in the midterm fetus. That's something you can measure. I'm not saying it happens in adults, but it's something you can measure with this technique. And Dennis Spear's group in Texas showed that one of the challenges the infant faces is that the measurements that they could make, they could show that the brain was probably using essentially the equivalent of all the glucose that the infant was producing. So how's the rest of the body running? Like we're running very close to the limits of what of to sustain life if the brain alone or is using the glucose produced by the liver. And also from his group, they showed later on that infant brain ketone metabolism was essentially equivalent to the adult after 3 or 4 days of fasting. So the infant brain is actively using ketones. And data that Valerie redrew from the original because the photocopies are crafty and you can understand. Arterial concentration versus the arterial venous difference, and the newborns had a steeper, much steeper slope than the children. So that's the basis for saying that it's very active at birth and probably during the period of lactation. And that between the two ketones, the acetoacetate is roughly twice as quickly taken up by the brain as beta hydroxybutyrate. I remind you that to metabolize ketones for energy, you have to get the beta hydroxybutyrate into the acetoacetate form. So again, it's a practical biological solution to make the product you really need more accessible to the brain than the buffer or the more stable one that we measure more frequently. So my conclusion from this body of work is that ketones are probably supplying 15 to 20%, and it's a bit of an artificial number. I don't know. No one has actually tried to calculate really what that number is, but it seems to be appropriate of the energy needs in the infant and in children, day in, day out, under totally normal circumstances. So I want to add another dimension to this, and that is that the brain in the infant, this white bar over here on the far left, at 5 kilograms. So in the first year of life, that's not an error. That's 65% of the energy requirements of the body are going to the brain in a 1-year-old. I know some of you have got 1-year-olds. They're roughly, obviously, they're not very functional humans yet, right? And yet, nature and our evolution has deemed it appropriate to target 65% of their energy requirements to an organ that's barely working. And that percentage is going to go down as they grow, as their body weight goes up. And the percentage of the other organs as the rest of the body grows is going to go up. So if we put the brain weights on there, you can see that the 650-gram brain is consuming 65%. And this brain, which is 2.5 times as big, is consuming more energy, but a lower percentage of the total whole body energy requirements in the adult. So this is not just an organ that's actively able to use ketones. It's huge in proportion to the body's overall proportions. So the question for me then becomes, well, okay, how does the infant actually make enough ketones to contribute to brain function and energetics? So we step back from the infant for a moment. We can summarize work that has been done over the years with a common available source of exogenous ketone, medium chain triglyceride. And there's actually a remarkably good correlation between the doses that have been administered between 10 and 70 grams in a single dose in different studies under different circumstances and the actual maximal beta hydroxybutyrate concentration that can be achieved in plasma. But that's an exogenous ketone. It's something you could buy at the health food shop. It's something we give to the patients to induce ketosis without changing too much of their lifestyle too quickly. Well, it's not just an exogenous ketone. It's present in maternal milk. And this schematic is showing that they are directly absorbed from the upper, very, very upper gut through the portal vein directly to the liver, as opposed to going through the peripheral circulation as a chylomicron in the lymph and being distributed everywhere, and a certain percentage getting to the liver that way. So the green line is for common dietary long-chain fatty acids, and number two, the red one, is for the ketogenic fats, medium-chain triglycerides. So the system is designed both in infants and in adults to absorb very rapidly medium-chain triglycerides. Is that a coincidence? Perhaps not. And the ketogenic fatty acids that are available to the infant, they're in breast milk, as I just mentioned. So we're talking about the 8, 10, and 12 carbon fatty acids, and they're present in breast milk fatty acids in about 3%, which represents for the average day's consumption of breast milk approximately 1 gram per day. Which, if any of you are thinking about what dose you might have been taking or patients that we've had in projects, it's about 15 grams, which is about half of what we've given as a supplement. So infants are getting that every day if they're on breast milk. And they're also storing part of that MCT supply in adipose tissue. They might be manufacturing it there. I don't think so, but they're definitely able to store part of the incoming supply. 0.4 to 0.5% doesn't sound like very much, but it represents newborn infants. How much fat does a newborn infant have? 500 to 600 grams. So 16 to 20 grams that's available as a reserve in this sort of highly metabolizable exogenous ketone. It's now an endogenous ketone. But they're not the only supply of ketogenic fatty acids. These are the images directly from the original papers. They're not too hard to see, but certain long-chain fatty acids are relatively ketogenic as well. And surprisingly, it's the unsaturated ones which are more ketogenic. And this is a complex graph that shows basically by chain length. The common ones in the diet that I want to refer to in red are 18 carbons, and these are the number of double bonds. And so what this shows is that if you have 5 double bonds on an 18 carbon fatty acid, you've got astronomical production. But that fatty acid that basically doesn't exist in our diet. So it does exist in some trace amounts, but there's no practical consequence, and neither is the 4 double bond version of that. But the 3, 2, and 1 double bond versions are more effective than the saturated fatty acids. And yet it's more complicated for the body to metabolize an unsaturated fatty acid than a saturated fatty acid. And yet they are more easily released from adipose tissue when you're fasting, which is the conditions that you're looking at. Those data are expressed in sort of opposite axes here. This is 1, 2, or 3 double bonds, and this is the relative mobilization. So the 18-1, 18-2, and 18-3 are right there in the middle. And yes, palmitic acid is also contributing. So these are not the exclusive long-chain fatty acids to be ketogenic, but they are going to be contributing. Not only are they released from adipose tissue more rapidly than other long-chain fatty acids, but they're activated by carboxyl palmityl transferase, CPT, which is an essential step in getting the fatty acid into the wood stove, into the mitochondria. Okay. So I asked a question there. And the most highly activated one is alpha-linolenic acid, activated by CPT, followed by linoleic acid, and oleic acid in the middle of the pack. So in practical terms, the infant is not just getting ketones from medium chain fatty acids, but there are others that are supplying, and they're present in a lot higher amounts. And so the reserve is much higher, both in breast milk and in adipose tissue. So what I'm trying to do is make the case that they're easily utilized by the infant brain, more so than in the adult brain. The enzymes are there to metabolize them, and the capacity to produce them from stores is available as well. To me, that's only half the story, because there's another part to it. And that is that ketones are anabolic substrates as well as fuels, in the sense that they can be used to make lipids. So again from the 1970s. It's a fuel comparison with the lipogenesis comparison with the tracer. These are done in the animal, in the rat. And from birth to adulthood, so this is a period of lactation, glucose can be used as a fuel by the rat brain. That stands to reason. But beta-hydroxybutyrate in their model was much more efficient as a fuel for the rat brain during lactation. They're much closer in the adult, but they're still higher in the adult. Lipogenesis refers to making fatty acids from scratch or sterols, cholesterol from scratch. And the difference is about 9-fold higher for beta-hydroxybutyrate than it is for glucose in the same system during lactation, but also in the adult. And remarkably, after we worked on these slides at some point, I wanted probably last night about 2 o'clock or something, I was looking through some of these old papers, and I hadn't realized that there was an even earlier paper that is showing not only is it higher, but it's stimulated. That's not a typo. It's stimulated by glucose. So glucose is helping ketones accomplish that goal. So what does lipogenesis mean to the brain? We'll come to that in a second. Let's just look at how that could happen. So this is a nice drawing. I don't know if BioRender helped us with this, but thank you, Valerie, for making this slide for me. The blood supply, the brain cell, and glucose coming in and gets to acetyl-CoA. Krebs cycle, beta-hydroxybutyrate can come in, gets converted to acetyl-CoA, Krebs cycle, or acetoacetate comes in. But notice that they can also be converted to acetyl-CoA in the cytoplasm, which is where the lipogenesis happens, and then fed via HMG-CoA reductase to sterol production, not reductase, synthase, and or the fatty acids. So that's what lipogenesis is. It's a pathway that glucose can contribute to by the red arrows, but ketones can go directly to it, and they don't have to go through the Krebs cycle to come back out to the cytoplasm to accomplish this, and that's why I call it a shunt. I think they call it a shunt as well. But the point is, this happens in the cytoplasm. It's much simpler than trying to go through the mitochondria, maybe losing your acetyl-CoA to ATP. So that's how ketones are contributing to lipogenesis in the neonatal brain as well. So to wrap up, my feeling is that ketones are an essential brain fuel in the developing, during early development. And it's particularly because the brain is so oversized for body size that glucose simply cannot supply all the needs. It's not just a fuel, it's actually contributing to lipid synthesis in the brain. And what that means is that you need lipids for myelination, and in older people, you need lipids perhaps for new myelination at some point, but also for myelin repair. And that means making cholesterol unsaturated and monounsaturated fatty acids to make the myelin and protect the message. And our next speaker, Maggie Watt, is going to tell you a little bit about the myelin repair story from an imaging perspective. I think those results help me at least understand why ketones could be therapeutically beneficial not only in the child, but in the adult as well. And I think they have implications for how we got into this mess with infants having oversized brains and being completely useless, whereas most mammals, their infants can get up and feed right away and run with mom within hours, and ours take a lot longer. So how does the natural selection actually permit that situation to arise? Well, you have this great source of fuel that allows the brain to slow down and get complex and then get functional. That's my perception. I wrote about this 20 years ago, and my book is still selling. I think I got $80 in royalties this year from it. I can buy a pizza and a case of beer once a year. We're working on a review article right now to bring these data back to life, because I think they've been mostly overlooked, forgotten. They're inaccessible by electronic searches, but I think they're extremely relevant to the subject of keto therapeutics. Thank you so much.